All right, folks. Well, welcome to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. You're listening to the Dr. Sandoval Show. Today, we're asking the question, how is my mental illness different from that of somebody who's got criminal mental illness, somebody who's willing to break the law and do some very dangerous, damaging things, including assaulting people, murdering, things along those lines? Is my mental illness going to get to that stage? And the great resounding answer for the majority of people is no, absolutely not. There are lots of people who live with mental illness, and we are actually in good company in the world of mental illness, in the world of therapy, in the world of psychiatry, if we consider that some of the saints themselves live with mental illness. I don't want anybody to worry that because they might be suffering from depression or anxiety, or even know somebody who's suffering from psychosis or bipolar disorder, that they're going to become a criminal. That's not necessarily the case. And especially with good support, with the idea that we can go to treatment and get medication, these are all important things to consider. And this is what I always tell my patients. I found this interesting article because it was the last thing that I shared with my patient who asked me that question. I said to him, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole of being really scared and seeing all these people with mental illness who did some heinous crimes, who ended up in the prison system and the court system and, the legal system, and all due to their mental illness. What's keeping anybody from doing that? Well, one, God's grace. Two, a good support system. Three, not losing hope. I would dare say practicing the Catholic faith. Prayer, mental illness at all. Prayer helps mental illness. It brings peace to the mind. Going to the sacraments, receiving the sacrament of confession, gives us hope, and continuing to understand that it still loves us. That's the bottom line, that there's nothing that's going to keep us from the love of God, even if the person suffers from mental illness. Now, this article that I found, I thought was very, very appropriate as I was talking to my patient, because I thought to him, I was thinking, how do I convince him that, that it's okay to be Catholic and suffer from mental illness if that's what you are experiencing? And this article is titled, "Some Saints Lived with Mental Illness." And it says this: did any of the saints live with mental illness? Yes. Most certainly some of them did. They were human. Mental illness has always been a part of the human condition. Saints lived with every kind of illness, and those who live with mental illness can give hope to the millions of people who live with mental illness today. And this is absolutely true. I thought this was a great article to consider, because a lot of times when people do suffer from mental illness, not everybody's so worried about the extreme of, am I going to end up with mental illness? It's so intense that I commit crimes, or that I don't know what's going on. I'm not in my right mind. I think the majority of people, though, feel very isolated, feel very alone, and they feel almost like there's some kind of a disfigurement, not physical, but mental. There's some kind of a mental handicap, some kind of that they are disabled. And that's not necessarily the case. The idea is that just because somebody is suffering from mental illness does not mean that they are excluded. And more importantly, the most important thing to think about, I would say, you're not excluded from the world of God's love. That's the key. That's the key at the end of the day, because what does it matter what the world thinks of me if God thinks I'm okay? And so it's important to consider, gosh, some of the people who were elevated to sainthood may have suffered from mental illness as well. So let's see what else the article has to say. It says, by suggesting that some saints live with mental illness does not diminish their legacy. And this is the key point. Just because somebody suffers from mental illness has nothing to do with who they are as a person themselves, or what they mean to God or to the world in God's eyes. To believe that would only perpetuate the stigma and discrimination that people who live with mental illness must endure. It would interfere with their living, and with the idea that it makes a person less than worthy of God's grace. So if somebody suffers from mental illness, a lot of times it's very common. A lot of people feel that they don't deserve God's grace, that they're not worthy of it, that there's something wrong with them. And it's easy to forget that we are all made in God's image and likeness, regardless of our physical state and regardless of our mental condition. So that's one of the things that, I'll be honest with you, a lot of psychiatrists struggle with. That we have to struggle through, especially if we are treating somebody who has a history of a criminal past that might have been due to their mental illness. Especially, let's say that you're treating somebody with a criminal past who's been abusive to children, or things of that nature. The society is very quick to say, "Hey, these people have to go. They've got to give them the chair, kill them, do something. They're evil. Everything's really, really bad." But as a psychiatrist, when you treat them, you have to take that step back and realize they're still made in the image and likeness of God. And if what Jesus says is true, which it is, I'm not going to doubt, is that his mercy is for everyone, no matter how heinous the crime. Something to consider. Let's see what else the article has to say. It says, the reality is that people who live with mental illness can have deep and profound insights into suffering, very true, and the mercy of God. God's grace is not limited by any condition, including mental illness. People who live with a mental illness can be especially close to God and live holy lives. That's something to consider. You know, we see that in the deliverance ministry. A lot of people ask if somebody is influenced by the devil, somebody says the extreme level of possessed by a demon. Does that mean that they're going to go to hell? And it has nothing to do with that. If you listen to Father Chad Ripperger again, he'll tell you, a lot of people who are fully possessed are very, very holy people. Two separate things. I say the same thing with mental illness. If somebody is suffering from mental illness, if somebody's being oppressed with depression or anxiety or things along those lines, has nothing to do with how close or far they are from God, because at the end of the day, that still has to do with whether they're committing sins or not that they might be responsible for. So that's true of anybody, really. And anybody with mental illness is no different. You're still in the grace of God. It doesn't mean that you're not going to go receive communion so long as you are not in a state of mortal sin. It doesn't mean that you cannot go into heaven. It's just another condition. And this is truly where we got to see mental illness as a medical condition, just like saying diabetes, high blood pressure. None of those are going to keep you from the kingdom of God. So let's see what else the article has to say. People with mental illness are uniquely joined to Christ. Pope St. John Paul II said, Christ took all human suffering on himself, even mental illness. Yes, even this affliction, which perhaps seems the most absurd and incomprehensible, configures the sick person to Christ and gives them a share in his redeeming passion. This is very true. And I like the fact that Pope John Paul has said that, where he said that mental illness is absurd and incomprehensible. At the end of the day, that's the truth. I don't understand it. I don't understand why we have to go through that. It's one of these things that we can say, well, why do we have to go through physical illness? We kind of understand that a little bit more because anybody who has been cut and their wound is healed understands that the body works in a way of healing. The body works in a way to take care of itself. We want to get rid of bacteria or infection and want to treat that. We understand that very well. Very common for people. But even then I find absurd. Absurd in the sense that we're always looking for perfection. We want to be perfect. We want to be free from any illness, any ailment, any imperfection. And we have to understand that's not going to happen in this life, not on this planet, not until we get to the resurrected state of heaven. That's really where our perfection is going to be. It's absurd. It's incomprehensible as far as mental illness goes. This is true. I agree with Pope St. John Paul II, but we might understand a little bit more when we make it to heaven. The article goes on to say, there are two saints, Saint Dymphna and Saint John of God, that stand out because their legacies have inspired entire communities to value and accompany people who live with mental illness. Yes, these are our two patron saints, Saint Dymphna and Saint John of God. Saint Dymphna is well known as a patron of people living with mental illness. She was a 7th century Irish princess who fled from her father, who seemed to have a mental illness, and she settled in Geel, Belgium, where she cared for people with mental illness. Because she lived so long, much of her story is shrouded. Because she lived so long ago, much of her story is shrouded in the midst of legend. So it is difficult to know with certainty much about Dymphna herself. However, what is known with certainty is that St. Dymphna's legacy inspired the people of Geel to show compassion for people who live with mental illness. Over the centuries, the people of Geel invited people with a mental illness to live and work in their community without any stigma or discrimination. Throughout the Middle Ages and even today, the town of Geel is known as a model for the community acceptance of people who live with mental illness. Think about how hard that would have been long ago to have done. Obviously, for Saint Dymphna, a work of love, a work where she could understand mental illness and she showed compassion to it. In today's day and age, there's so much stigma, even though we have much more knowledge, we understand treatment, and we seem to try to understand the human condition a little bit more. Think about back in the days of St. Dymphna, the 7th century, where mental illness was probably easily confused with demonic possession for sure, or confused with, some kind of an illness that was not going to get better. How much more would people have been shunned back then, put on an island or a different part of town? And yet when St. Dymphna comes around, she says, hey, we got to show some compassion, and converts a whole town's heart to allow people to work there and to live there without any stigma or discrimination. It's always inspiring to me, something to work towards here in our own communities. Well, let's look at what the article has to say about St. John of God. It goes on to say the legacy of St. John of God continues to inspire people to provide good and compassionate medical care for people who live with mental illness. St. John of God lived in Spain in the 15th century, so obviously after St. Dymphna. In his midlife, his mental health deteriorated, and he was sent to Royal Hospital in Granada, Spain, a psychiatric facility. As was typical at that time, his care was harsh and inadequate. There you go. Back in the day, even now, actually, we do a lot of good job with mental illness nowadays. It's not harsh or inadequate. It's hard sometimes to control the mental illness. We work with the medication that we have and the treatments that we have. But back in the day, the treatment was harsh and inadequate. The article says, despite this treatment, over time, John recovered and he was able to visit with other patients and help the nurses in their care. He was released from the hospital, and John dedicated himself to help the poor, sick, and homeless who often live with a mental illness. Now, think about how well he must have done that he was actually released from the hospital. Back in the day, if you ended up in a mental hospital, and an asylum, as they used to call them, good luck getting out. It was very uncommon for somebody, once they entered, to actually leave. And sometimes because the medications were so harsh, probably made the person worse. But most of the time, because there was no idea that anybody would get better on their own, or there was not necessarily an idea of trying to treat somebody so that they would get better. Usually they treated patients to calm them down. So they would, as we say, sometimes snow them or give them high doses of medication that would just kind of keep them sleepy. So this is what it goes on to say about St. John of God. He drew followers who were inspired by his holiness and compassion. Today, his followers are known as the Hospitalier Brothers of St. John of God. They continue his mission of caring for the poor and those with mental illness by operating hospitals and medical care facilities in over 50 countries. Now, the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministries sees the legacies of St. Dymphna and St. John of God as models for mental health ministry. They provide free St. Dymphna and St. John of God prayer cards for those to use in mental health ministries. The bottom line of this is that we're not alone. If anybody suffers from mental health, out there, you're not alone. You got saints to look up to, where the church is not going to abandon you or tell you that you cannot make it to God. And I don't want anybody to worry that just because they suffer from mental illness, that all of a sudden they're going to turn into a criminal mind or go extreme like that.